Well, the use of chemical weapons by both the Syrian regime and Daesh has been confirmed in a report released by the United Nations and the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons.
The leadership panel determined that it had sufficient information to reach a conclusion on the actors involved in 3 cases. In the case of Talmenes, 21st of April 2014, and Sarmin, 16th of March 2015, the panel concluded that Syrian Arab armed forces, and in particular the Air Force, were responsible for the attack, which released toxic substances.
Well, the report has been discussed by the UN Security Council, and the Syrian ambassador to the United Nations, Bashar al-Jafari, says the findings are not convincing.
The conclusions contained in the report were totally based on statements made by witnesses presented by the terrorist armed groups or their incubator environment. Therefore, these conclusions lack any physical evidence, whether by samples or attested medical reports, that chlorine was used.
Well, TRT1's Kahraman Haliscelik is in New York with more on that meeting.
Diplomats at the UN Security Council met behind closed doors to discuss whether to sanction the Assad regime over the use of chemical weapons. Last week, international inspectors determined that Assad's forces used chemical weapons at least twice in violation of international law. The Security Council passed a resolution in 2013 which threatened Damascus with sanctions and military force if the regime used chemical weapons. The US ambassador to the UN, Samantha Power, called on the Council to act swiftly and said she expected a new UN Security Council resolution on Syria soon. France and Britain also pressed for sanctions against Damascus. Britain's UN ambassador, Matthew Rycroft, described the Syrian regime's use of chemical weapons as a war crime. He said everyone responsible for those crimes must be held accountable and treated accordingly. Russia's UN ambassador Vitaly Churkin was less enthusiastic about possible sanctions. He implied that Russia would rule out extending the mandate of international inspectors, which expires on September 24. Human rights organizations called on Security Council to act swiftly to impose sanctions on the Assad regime and to refer the case to the International Criminal Court. The Security Council is expected to hold meetings until it reaches agreement on what steps, if any, to take against Assad regime.